And we are live with Sharif El-Mekki, my friend, brother, colleague, back with another Freedom Friday. How you feeling this morning?
Feeling good, feeling good. Always glad to see you. And Freedom Friday is a great way to head towards the end of the week. And it's looking forward to having this complex conversation.
I love that you call it a complex conversation because that's exactly what it is for our viewers, people joining us, for the family, for the Freedom Friday family joining us today. We are discussing the Brown versus Board of Education landmark case that went to the Supreme Court in 1954 and resulted in a ruling that has been seen as a pivotal point in American education and in American politics. That court case basically struck down, that decision, I should say, struck down the previous standing legal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson, which called for separate but equal, meaning that there would be state-sanctioned division of the races that put people into government services like education on the basis of their race and their background. That was Plessy. As long as those separate circumstances were considered to be equally resourced or equal in some respect, then it was fine. What Brown versus Board of Education did was say that is not fine. The state cannot separate people on the basis of race, and they sure as hell can't separate people on the basis of race and put some of them into inferior conditions and others into prime conditions, and still be constitutional, because the Constitution calls for us all to have equal rights under the law. So that was the case. I want to set it up for this discussion today to say that we as a Black family nationally have not had a nuanced and complex enough conversation about whether or not that landmark decision was everything that we thought it was. If we're talking about educational progress in the Black community, we have to actually talk about this part of history with a little bit more maturity now that we've had 65 years to look back on it. That's the setup. Good morning, friends, family. I see y'all jumping in the comments already. Please put anything into the comments that you think is a resource or a point that needs to be said to the family about this particular case. So, my good brother El-Mekki, where do we start?
Where do we start? Where do we start? I think, just quickly reminding folks that immediately after Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and even before then, there were some secret Black schools. And after that, there were tons and tons, hundreds and thousands of all Black schools with no indication that, these had to be integrated for us to be successful. Like that wasn't the narrative at that point. Narrative was like, we're going to educate our own. Yeah, you can come help us. You can help fund us, even though we're doing a lot of the funding ourselves. But there was no like, hey, you white people build a school so we can come there. That wasn't the narrative at that point. And so, but at some point after the turn of the century, that started to be a conversation. But again, a lot of times it was led, by organizations like NAACP or people who had actually, maybe went to school up south, as Malcolm called it, the northern part.
Wow.
And went to integrated schools. But we have to recognize that segregated schools is not just a southern thing. It was part of the American recipe, because we know that shortly after the terrorism and genocide against Native American and Black people, white folks made a pact that this country would always guarantee white superiority in all its institutions.
And each plot point in history, legal history, racial history, and education history, you see a couple of steps forward for Black and oppressed people, and then 3 steps backwards in a lot of cases. right? So it's not a linear line of forward progress year by year. It's some wins and then some losses that really erase many of the wins. And that happens because the racial physics of institutions in the United States is that if you make a few steps forward, oppression and racism and white supremacy and institutional racism make sure to constantly have a self-cleaning oven. They wipe away whatever gains you make in the economy, in schooling, and in just about any area of life activity in the United States. Brown was seen as one of those huge steps forward. And I think we have to talk about it in terms of the historical perspective. What did the people who were participating in it think at the time, and what did they think later? So here's part of the setup that I have for it. Charles, you can't talk about Brown versus Board without talking about Charles Houston, who was the legal genius behind it for many years, the attorney of note on record for how we were going to form a strategy to break down Jim Crow. They call him the man who killed Jim Crow. He was the mastermind of the strategy that eventually would be used by his protege, Thurgood Marshall, who fought the case, the Brown case, before the Supreme Court 4 years, I think, after Houston died. Houston was trying to fight a lot of other cases and eventually landed on the Brown case in this way. Prince Edward County was a school district where there was a black strike of students who formed a student strike, and then their parents joined and their community joined, of black students who were going on strike in their school district to stop the unequal funding to black schools. They wanted plumbing and facilities and school books that weren't handed down to them, and they wanted to be treated as human in their black schools. When the NAACP got the call to come and help them, they had to work on them and convince them that facilities and schools and resources wasn't the goal. The goal was integration of the local public schools. And that was something that the local black folks didn't think was their goal. They had to be convinced. That is the case that eventually became Brown versus Board of Education.
Yeah. And when you look at it, and people should know this, Brown versus Board is a more than one district. It's not just a lot of people associated with Topeka, Kansas, and Linda Brown, the child who wanted to go to the school closer to her home. But interestingly enough, right, like her mother and the black people in Topeka, Kansas said Kansas was a weird space, right? Like, you know, and it always, prior to the Civil War, they were like some just stuff going on afterwards. And they actually said like, hey, we're going to give equal schools. Right. And black people were able to say like, hey, this isn't equal. And the school board would fix it. Right. Because they're just like, hey, we don't want y'all in our school. Well, I should say, we don't want your elementary school students. So the elementary schools in Topeka, Kansas were all black. Right. They were segregated. The junior high school and the high schools were particularly the high school was integrated. Right. So the high school was integrated. The elementary schools were all black. There were 4 elementary schools. And Linda Brown, the child whose name is associated with, or the family that's associated with Brown versus Board, this is Linda Brown and the child and their parents. They said, we're not fighting this. And they were reluctant signers on. They didn't actually want to join this. Father was a pastor. His church was not down with shutting down black schools. And so he was like, I'm very reluctant. He did not want to be involved in this at all. They said the only reason that they were doing this because the white school was 7 blocks away. That's it. They were just like, just the distance itself. They were like, oh, the elementary schools are fantastic. These black teachers are amazing. It's an extension of home. Like time after time again, if you speak to the Topekans of that time, most of them were against what the NAACP had come in to do, the national NAACP. So much so forth, the local NAACP had trouble getting recruits. They went from having like 600 members till they said, no, we're going to shut down these black schools. You got to go to the white school, all the way down to 92 members.
I think what you're pointing out here, too, is really important, that the Brown family, Linda Brown, had to walk a couple of miles across train tracks and through a couple of dangerous intersections to get to the black school. And on the way there, she would pass by a perfectly good school that she was excluded from in her neighborhood and close to her, of which she was in an integrated neighborhood. Some of her neighbors actually went to that closer school. So their real fight was not against the inferiority of black schools versus white schools. It was proximity to a school, to not be told by the government, you can't enter this government building, right? That's close to you like everyone else can. That's different than thinking that your sole salvation in education is to get into a white school, right? That it's a little bit different when you couch it that way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Very different. And quote after quote talks about how effective that one of these elementary schools had more teachers with master's degrees than any other school in the city, including the white schools, right? And we've spoken before about how well educated black teachers were during that time. And so and the thing about it, they had the lived experience, right? They're going to these all black elementary school with all black teachers and doing well, growing. These schools were not only doing the content, they went above the state standards in education. They were including things around positive racial identity and things like that. And then they went to the integrated high school, and many of them said we were suffering in the integrated high school. So they already saw what we see now where, oh yeah, that can be this Tony suburb. And you have, it can be like Upper Dublin in Pennsylvania that just settled a lawsuit recently where 7% of the students are black, but almost half of the suspensions they're locked out of the advanced courses. They all have to take, no matter what grades they got in middle school, no matter what their test scores, they were automatically tracked to the fourth lowest. They have 4 tiers of education. The black kids automatically got tracked to the 3rd and 4th tier, no matter what their grades were, no matter what their skill sets were, right? And it wasn't even like a 4th tier, we're giving you these hands-on experience. It was just like, that's the basement, that's where you belong. They already saw that in Topeka, Kansas, because when they compare their experience as an elementary school student, I'm thriving, I'm loved, I'm in my element, to go into the high school where they're snubbed, marginalized, and disillusioned.
Yeah, we should really hammer this point about the difference in opinion between black communities and the NAACP, and we should put a class focus on it for real.
Right.
Many of the people that the NAACP would attempt to recruit in communities to be part of the case were people of moderate means. They were either working class or lower working class. They were fighting literally for resources. We can say that a lot was going well in their schools. They had great black teachers. They had pedagogy and things that were supportive of black people developing properly. And at the same time, they had hand-me-down books. They had inferior facilities in a lot of cases, and they knew it. So their fight really was to get their fair share. Their local school boards were doling out money on the basis of race. White schools got all the good stuff, and the school board, which we're today told that a democratically elected school board is the end all be all, but the school boards were the main arbiter of inequity in their local areas. And the black folks were fighting for their fair share. They weren't fighting necessarily to sit their kids next to white folks. But enter the NAACP. NAACP had always been a fairly elite group of people, no matter where they were. And if you look, this is, I'm going to make a couple observations that I think are worth saying, but not everybody listening may think it's important. But even if you look at the pictures, the entire legal team of the NAACP is entirely made up of light-skinned people, right? I don't think that's an insignificant point to point out, because they had elite educations. They were the cream of the crop of black people in black society in ways that would not be considered fair today. And their whole theory was, if we can just get across the line to make us fully acceptable within the white world, that will be everything. That was their entire everything. So they really had a little patience for local black folks who couldn't see the light, that this was the real fight, to make us whole, to make us human. That's a significant point to keep pointing out about this case and the cases that, because still today we have this dynamic between black elite and black leadership who see their soul salvation in fully making it across the crossover line versus the interest of black communities.
Yeah, and it's important to know. So we talked about that. There's Topeka, Kansas. There's some other, I think one's in South Carolina. One is another one. I don't remember where the others, 2 or 3 schools were. We'll pull that up and share. Some of those were like, dilapidated buildings. Teachers that were not the way that they were described in Topeka, as far as like caring and effective and things like that. So it's kind of like how schools are now in some of our inner cities, where they are lead infested, vermin infested, all of those kind of things. That wasn't the case. So, but instead of kind of learning from Topeka, like, hey, what's going on here? As well as other places where it's all Black and all thriving. There started to be this narrative that, that the NAACP was peddling at the time to win the case, right? I don't think they actually believed this, but they thought like, hey, this is the legal strategy to win this case. But what, the unintended consequences that people, including the Supreme Court justices, who were all born in the 1800s, right? And so when you read, you're like, how did that group of people think that, oh, we are going to just go say, some of it's the savior mentality, right? But, and we'll get into this, when they looked at integration, they weren't looking, integration is kind of a two-way street if you're driving, right? Like, you guys here, they're like, no, we're going to shut yours down and coming to us, because just the lack of presence of us near you makes you feeble and weak and unintelligent, right? We got to be careful about, so laws are the product of a people. And what is America in 1954? Do we really think that they had this love of Black people? I can guarantee you the justices on that bench harbored deep anti-Black tendencies.
Oh, and that's known. I mean, if you really read the background on who they were at the time, some of them had deeply problematic ideas about Black people that ended up in their findings, their rulings. And this is where it's important, I think, to talk about the line of Black intellectual thought about this particular case, about integration, desegregation as a strategy for our progress. Today, if we talk about this issue, we only have a handful of people that we talk about. And the people today who are most popularizing the issue, the people who are celebrated for talking about this issue, have one opinion about it. Black intellectual thought, the line of Black intellectual thought on this idea is mixed. Not everybody was for it. Not everybody was against it. Not everybody thought it was the best strategy. But here's some people that get left out. Derek Bell was a young attorney who worked on these cases and fought them, and eventually came to believe that it was the wrong case. Yeah, so this is Derek's book here. And for people listening, I'm sure most of you know Derek Bell is the person who created critical race theory, which basically tells us that institutional racism is permanent. It's not temporary. And because of that, many of our efforts to do things like integrate are going to always be foiled. We're going to be beating our heads against the wall. He was somebody who came to that opinion and popularized it in critical race theory based upon the aftermath of the Brown case. Kenneth Clark, Dr. Kenneth Clark, who was the person who did the doll test, him and Mamie Clark, his wife, both doctors, both psychologists, I believe, did the doll test, which basically showed if you put white dolls and black dolls in front of Black kids, they would always pick the white doll for positive factors, like what's the prettier doll? What's the smarter doll? What's the doll that is a bigger liar? Those type of things. They would always pick the white doll. The justices in the case saw that as the result of being segregated. It created inferiority. The being segregated from white people created a sense of inferiority. Kenneth Clark, who did that test later in 1968, wrote a paper in Harvard Review called Alternative Public Schools, where he called for a completely different pathway now. He had learned his lesson over time. Brown was not the way to go. And he called for what very much, and people should read the paper so that they know that I'm not making too much of it. He called for something that very much looks like charter schools. He called for independently run private schools run by nonprofits and universities, even unions and others that specifically address the needs of Black children. outside of the system. And this is the guy who did the doll test in the Seminole case. These are people that we don't talk about much when we talk about the long line of Black thought on Brown. I don't know why we do that, but it's clear that we only want the positives, the people who are positive about integration to be lifted up.
No, absolutely. And you know what? One of the things that when we talk about Brown and you know, it's named after, you know, after them. One of her quotes is, and she's been interviewed many times, you know, in the aftermath, like, what do you think? What do you think? And one of the things that I thought was really poignant that she said is quality education was not the issue for us at the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what they're saying is we had quality education. Now, how many of y'all, how many listeners, how many Black children, the 8 million Black children around this country can say I'm receiving quality education? Linda Brown of Brown versus Education versus Board of Education is saying we had quality of education. It was only the distance that I had to go to acquire the quality education.
Mm-hmm.
What she was advocating for was access to quality education neighborhood schools. If it was an all Black neighborhood school, they would have definitely not even signed on at all. They were already reluctant to, because they're like, this is going to undermine the quality education that we receive. The school board was already saying, like, yo, if this goes through, we firing these Black teachers. Because y'all not coming. Nobody wants Black teachers teaching white children.
You know, what's really interesting about Cheryl Henderson Brown, who's the sister of Linda Brown. She's the daughter of Reverend Oliver Brown, whose name is Brown on the case. I interviewed her. She told me a couple of interesting things about their family and about their situation. One of the things she told me was that her dad was not a member of the NAACP and was not easy to recruit for this case. But one of his best friends, who was an attorney, was working with them and convinced him to do it. Mm-hmm. The reason his name, Brown, is on the case is because the only other people they recruited were 12 moms and him. Since he was the only man, they had to put his name on the case because having 12 moms or any moms, Black moms, was seen as a loser. Like that would lose the case. So they had to put it underneath a man. She basically said that's why her dad was really recruited.
Back to that legal strategy, right? Like who's best to argue this in front of white justices? All right, let's get the lighter skinned guys. Oh, and now let's tap into their misogyny. And make sure that a man is leading this or looked at as leading this effort.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, the NAACP has a history of that too. With like, you know, there was a case before, and Dr. Howard Fuller reminds me all the time about this. There was a case before Rosa Parks, you know, I'm not getting up out of the seat case with a previous teenager, and the NAACP passed over her because they didn't think that she had an appropriate sexual life in some ways or shapes or forms. She wasn't seen as a model, you know, character. Cheryl Henderson Brown, I asked her a question. When her dad passed away in 1961, and I asked her if he had seen the result of his vision for what he was fighting for when he was in that case. And she said, in some ways, no, because, you know, he was never really about what you just said is true. He was never really about this as the panacea. He just wanted proximity was a big question for them, not the quality. And she says in the aftermath, little known fact, the integrated kids, the superintendent of Kansas, Topeka schools sent a letter to all the teachers, the Black teachers, telling them they would lose their job if this case won. Mm-hmm. And he basically told them they better hope that the case didn't go through and didn't win, because the Black schools would be shut down. They'd be fired. She says in the aftermath, some of those teachers were retained, but they had to place a phone call to every white parent and ask their permission to teach their white children. And if the parents didn't give it to them, it was a no-go. Mm-hmm. Oliver Brown passed away seeing that as the aftermath, and was very concerned about that's exactly the opposite of what he thought was going to happen. That was not what he wanted from the case. So no, he passed away not having seen the real vision that he had realized in the case.
Yeah, and absolutely. And when you look at you know, the few Black teachers that ended up hired to teach in white schools, you know, several of them started as half days, you know, pay cuts. And we saw, like, not just in Kansas, this is like, some states said it's better not to have public education at all instead of integrating, right? And so when you look at like a Zora Neale Hurston, right, she reluctantly later wrote a letter, because initially apparently she had just said, you know what, I'm going to stay out of this, I'm not going to get involved in it. But eventually she wrote a letter, and she talked about this idea that there's some kind of folktale, I didn't know about this, but some kind of folktale that a mule will follow a white mare anywhere, if the stable's open. And she used that analogy, and just like, this is what this is saying, that we're only better if we're in proximity. She's like, there are great Black schools. Why aren't we just replicating that? Let's fight for the resources to make sure that all our schools receive the resources that they have, great teachers, great building, state of the art, all of those kind of things. Yep. And she describes this thing like, why would I rely on a court to pass a law for me to go somewhere where I know we have hundreds of years of documentation and evidence, as well as current day, that they don't want us there, and they are not going to protect our children? Why would we look at that as a celebration? Like, yes, take my child. I know you're racist, but take my child anyway. Damn it, the law says it.
Yeah, I actually love that you brought her up, and I'm putting it on the screen for people to look at. Part of the deeper discussion that we have to have about these type of issues, if we're like being mature about how we talk about them, is we have to put things on the record. So when I talk about Black intellectual thought and the history of it, this is Zora Neale Hurston in 1955. She has to be on record. Her voice has to be part of this conversation. She was a major thought leader for Black communities. You can't not talk about her, right? Like cherry pick who you talk about. We know that W.E.B. Du Bois wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of integration as the sole strategy. Now, he's a founder of the NAACP. He was at odds with them for years over this. He wrote a piece called "Does the Negro Need Separate Schools?" Many people know about this. Everybody knows about this if you've like really spent a lot of time digging in. He summed it up to sum up this: theoretically, the Negro needs neither segregated schools nor mixed schools. What he needs is education. What he must remember is that there is no magic either in mixed schools or in segregated schools. A mixed school with poor and unsympathetic teachers with hostile public opinion and no teaching of truth concerning Black folk is bad. A segregated school with ignorant placeholders, inadequate equipment, poor salaries, and wretched housing is equally bad. Other things being equal, the mixed school is the broader, more natural basis for education of all youth. It gives wider context, it inspires greater self-confidence, and suppresses the inferiority complex. But other things seldom are equal. And in that case, sympathy, knowledge, and the truth outweigh all that mixed schools can offer. It's a pretty balanced opinion. He's basically, I think, in there saying, the goal would be for everybody, the brotherhood of man, to all be together in a school. Of course, that would be great. World peace would be great. Lots of things would be great. But we don't live in a great world. We live in a real world. And in this real world, all things aren't equal. And in that case, you can't actually think that mixed schools are really the goal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and when I think about, one of the key things that Malcolm said, not necessarily specifically to this, but he talked about this, our people had the mistake of confusing the methods with the objectives.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we think the overall objective was integration, then we're looking at it very differently than what many of how our ancestors looked at it. They were looking at, how do we be safe? How do we able to raise our children? How do we achieve justice? But they did not look at integration as the panacea that was going to solve all of the hatred and anti-Blackness that our kids were going to encounter. As I said, if I can look at Upper Dublin, I'm repeating their name, but they're not alone. They're, if you Google any state and look at, racism in schools, you're going to find all kind of things, lawsuits and subpoenas and all kind of things. Right. And so he says, Our people have made the mistake of confusing the methods with the objectives. As long as we agree on the objectives, we should never fall out with each other just because we believe in different methods or tactics or strategy to reach a common objective.
Mm-hmm.
We have to keep in mind at all times that we are not fighting for integration, nor are we fighting for separation. We are fighting for recognition as human beings. We are fighting for the right to live as free humans in this society. In fact, we are actually fighting for rights that are even greater than civil rights, and that is the human rights, right? And so that's what it, and later Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture kind of said the same thing. We're not fighting for, integration or separation. We're fighting for liberation, right? The same thing that, white America was promised as part of the Manifest Destiny and all the other genocidal theories that they came up with.
Do you find it interesting that the people who fought this case the most, Charles Houston, Thurgood Marshall, and many like them, really came out of very excellent Black schools, only to argue to the country and the nation that very excellent Black schools weren't possible. So Charles Houston came out of Dunbar in DC, right? And then went to Harvard. Right from that, and then became the dean of Howard's Law School and made it the Harvard of Black world. Right. So a Black excellent school set up Charles Houston to go to Harvard and be one of the few Black people to graduate, and set him up to become the dean and rebuild the law school of Howard and make it the Harvard of Black world, which has produced more Black attorneys and Black educators and Black doctors, these HBCUs and schools like Howard, than any other institution. So it's ironic to me that they would come out. Thurgood Marshall went to Frederick Douglass High School in Baltimore, again, a Black school that produced, famous other Black people like Langston Hughes and Cab Calloway and others. And he went on to Lincoln University and HBCU, only to eventually argue that excellent Black schools weren't possible. Isn't that a little ironic?
Yeah. And speaking of these folks, like, so we talked about Zora Neale Hurston, Julia Cooper, like legendary Black educator. They interviewed her when she was around 100, and they said, "What do you think?" And she said, "This is a bad idea." Like the brain of our children, the intellectual development of our children, the self-esteem of our children, the broader content, right? Ensuring that Black children learn about Black culture and Black contributions to this society as well as humanity as a whole is going to be undermined if all we are looking at is like, integration is the answer.
I think that's really important, because another part of the record that people don't pay attention to is the fact that Black educators warned the NAACP and others against this strategy of integration. They warned that they were going to be absorbed, they were going to be subsumed, and assumed in a lot of the things that they were possessing in terms of pedagogical practices and advancements that they had made would be lost. They had to be convinced, like every other group of non-NAACP Black people. The educators eventually were supportive of the NAACP because they were good soldiers, and they wanted to believe in it, they wanted to see it, but they literally warned that what happened would come true, which is we would lose Black educators, Black schools, Black pedagogy, and many of our kids would be lost in a system that wasn't preparing them for democracy and for life and for freedom. And I think Dr. Howard Fuller mentioned to me, I can't remember which group it was that participated in Brown versus Board, who said that if they had to go back and do it again, they wouldn't have used so much sociological research. They would have tapped into educational research and Black educators. They would have listened to the Black educators instead of listening to sociologists who were telling them that the only way to win educationally is to get Black kids into white company.
Exactly. And then speaking of that, right? So if we go back to that original pact about whiteness, that, a promise to them, you and your progeny will always be, it's almost like you read some of the old biblical and Quranic scriptures. God gave a covenant to groups of people, and like, hey, your people will be saved. They'll do. whiteness did the same thing differently though, because they're like, we're gonna like kill everybody else, make sure everybody else is underneath our feet, our foot is on their neck, or our knee is on their neck, whatever the case may be. And you don't have to worry about it. We're going to build these institutions to support that promise, no matter what the facade looks like, no matter what the veneer may look like. Right. Mm-hmm. And so when you see that, and then you look at the language that was given in the verdict, right? When you look at what the justices, how they wrote, the segregation of white and colored children has a detrimental effect on the colored children. Not that segregation has a detrimental effect on children.
Yeah.
He said not being around white people destroys black kids. Yeah. Right. And that goes back to, if you do the research about like why they felt like they were needed to kill us and brown people in the beginning, because like they're savages. We have to pacify the natives. We have to change them in order for them. Right. You read their quotes, governmental quotes, educators. They say, oh, the black and brown people are hundreds of years behind us in civilization. Mm-hmm. Right. So this is a continuation. None of this stuff is new. It is all connected theory and mindset. Right. And so if we enslave you so that we can humanize you and civilize you rather, then years later, 1950, you're like, well, the next part of your civilization is being here. Right. They didn't say it would be very different. They say, you know what, separating the students where they live in maybe an integrated neighborhood and they have to go to different schools, all of that. Maybe that does something to both groups of children. Because if you thought about it like that way, you would say, hey, some of you white teachers, you're going to go to the black schools. Some of the black, you're just going to mix it up. You also up north, you would say, let's not have segregated housing. Let's not build projects for blocks and blocks and blocks, and only black people can go there. Right. Mm-hmm. You'd be thinking about it very differently if it was just this, oh, we love humanity. We love black folks. No, this is a sinister anti-blackness that continue the legacy of the superiority. Sorry, Mama. I know I'm not supposed to say that word. White people.
What did she say? What did you not tell you?
White savagery is not white
savagery.
White supremacy.
Yeah. This is a good point, because this is this plays to how they were able to sell integration. The white man's burden. Mm-hmm. Like, we owe it to them to let them come next to our greatness. That's how they sold it. They sold it as lifting up, blacks into the real world. That's how you sold Indian boarding schools and many other educational ideas too. And still today, it gets under my skin when I see people at like the Century Foundation, Nicole Hannah-Jones, and others who lift up studies that say it greatly improves the test scores of black students, and it doesn't at all even hurt the white students at all. It doesn't improve them, but it doesn't hurt them, right? I mean, that's the pitch. The pitch is, it's as great for the minorities, and it doesn't even hurt white people at all. Yeah. So you guys don't have to worry about it. You don't, it's just let's make them great again by bringing them next to you. Yeah. It's such an insulting, anti-black, self-hating, self-loathing line of attack, intellectual attack.
Yeah. And you see it in Philly over the past couple of years. You have a couple areas that are being gentrified. And you have two dynamics. One, there are places that are being gentrified, and there are other places that were already mixed. But what you see white families, maybe in kindergarten, they'll put their kids in, but by the time they're third grade, they're like, nah, we out of here. You know what I mean? Like, oh, that black boy is cute when he's 4 and 5, but you know what? He's 11 now. He looks pretty menacing. I can't. This is the same thing that Dwight Eisenhower, I believe, was the president at the time of this. And he said, he sounds like remarkably like 45. Like that's what I'm saying. Like people are like, oh, 45. Oh my gosh. Like it's the same. Study your history. Dwight Eisenhower, who's looked at as like, oh, listen, he did this, he did that. He also said, hey, all these racist Southerners aren't bad. They just don't want their precious white, and this is a quote, they don't want their precious white daughters sitting next to the big black buck. That's what he told one of the Supreme Justices over dinner at the White House, right? During the case. He's like, listen, you should he's trying to influence the Supreme Court, which they do, right? But he's telling them directly, don't be upset with them. They're just protecting their purity.
I mean, think about that for a minute, right? Like as part of the psychology. In the aftermath of Brown versus Board, white resistance became a thing where people kept saying it was underestimated. Like nobody expected the level of white resistance that there was to it. And it wasn't always overt. In Boston, they had riots where they beat up Black people and, they did really hostile, aggressive things. They burned buses and, just crazy stuff. Okay, so that's one level of anger. But the softer form of anger and hidden part is what you just said. The Black children in your school in the early elementary grades is cute, but, by middle school, we'll start moving our white kids into other schools. It's the invisible white hand, the behavioral economics that all of a sudden just white people aren't here anymore. You integrated a whole district.
Where did they go?
Where did they go? They just disappeared. They disappeared. Where did the white people go? Right? Like it happens to malls. It happens to schools. It happens to school districts, to neighborhoods, to cities. You force these things and suddenly the white people just disappear. No one really says it. No one talks about it as they're doing it. And these are liberal people too. These aren't just like one kind of white people. It's just weird that in Oakland, you have white people, all liberal, living up in the Oakland Hills, and they want their schools to. It's just weird that they end up in the same place. That happens in every city. That is the invisible white hand of behavioral economics that happens no matter what you do. You can set up boundaries to try and integrate. You can set up policies. You can pass laws. You can get judges involved. And look where we are 65 years later. That is winning. They are still winning. That invisible hand is still winning. So you have to be a damn fool at this late date to still be believing that that's the strategy to go with. We will force white people to accept us in their schools and want that big, what did you say, buck? Black
big
buck?
Big black buck.
That big black buck suddenly is going to become acceptable in 2020 after 65 years of trying. How dumb are we supposed to be, Sharif? Help me out, brother. Like, what are we supposed to, why?
Yeah.
Why?
I mean, when I was younger, someone talked about the civil rights movement was supposed to be a consumer rights movement, not something to that we should subject our kids to. And so when you look at that, even people saying, so when you play this out, right, the chasing of, how Zora Neale Hurston would say the mule chasing the white mare, or Black folks and elite Black folks particularly chasing whiteness. There's a peculiar phenomena because it also ended up shutting down not only Black schools and firing of Black teachers. It also shut down Black businesses, right? It ended up being where, like, you know what? I don't know if I want to keep my money in our community like every other community does. The other place has to be better. It has to be same product, but it has to be better, right? And so when you look at that in education, and where you automatically assume that a school is inherently better because they have white students. And if you believe that, why aren't the white students by the district or school board or Supreme Court, whoever, being sent to those Black? If it's the white students themselves, why aren't they just being sent, dispersed, around the school? There's a very particular one-way street about this.
The people who push integration today, why do you think they're never really called out for the insulting premise of their argument? Their argument being that this really is the only thing that has ever worked. Getting Black kids into white schools, reducing the peer effect of too many Black people being together in one place is the only thing that has ever worked. Why is it that we still have people winning Pulitzers for that idea?
Well, I think a couple of reasons. I think, it's like the other schools that were lumped into the Brown versus Board, where their situation was very different than the Topekans. It was very different than the Nathal Musasa that I went to, or the Marcus Garvey Shule that my friends went to. It is very different. So they were in buildings that were underfunded. Where in Topeka, they were trying to fund both schools, at least elementary schools, because remember the high schools were already integrated. They were trying to fund them equitably. And so I think what people conflate is that, yes, and absolutely, you're absolutely right. Resources follow white children. Resources follow white children. So we absolutely know that is you see it in the neighborhoods, you see it in the schools, you see where cities invest their funding. It's wherever it's white, or whether it's downtown in Philadelphia, or other places in other cities, wherever it is, that's going to occur. So we have to decide, like, what is the strategy to address that? Because even if you get in those places, you're still, as we said in the example earlier, 7% of the population, but almost 50% of the suspensions. So even if you're there, you're not being treated as an equal. So yes, the resources there, you're just being discriminated in a well-lit school.
You're at a well-lit school
in a beautiful, curated, landscape. Doesn't make it any less toxic to our children.
I mean, that point is well taken. When people say it's the only thing that ever worked, getting these kids into schools, they're basically saying their life outcomes have become better because they know the secret handshakes of whiteness, and they do better in the long run. They get better jobs. They live in better neighborhoods. They're more accepted and acceptable because they had these school experiences early in life. But when I say that it's never really worked, you just pointed out, even when we have so-called integrated kids into suburban schools and into buildings, they have been put in lower educational tracks in those buildings. They have not been put into AP. They have not been identified as gifted even when they qualify. They have been put in lower tracks in separate rooms in many cases. You can go to school districts where you go into an integrated school, and many of the black kids go one direction in the morning, and many of the white kids go a different direction in the same building.
Yeah, I'll see you after school.
See you after school. Love playing what you see at basketball practice, right?
Yeah, maybe.
So the idea that it's the only thing that ever worked, it worked for a handful of bougie elite Negroes who came to believe that it's the only way to educate kids in their adult life, and that they now push the idea that white water is wetter. That's their educational philosophy. White ice is colder. But I don't know why we play along with it. I don't know why we allow it as without being challenged.
Yeah, I mean, that's my whole thing, where anything is looked at as this is the only way. And I think it goes back to Malcolm, like looking at the strategy. Yeah, we may disagree, but let's agree on like what the end game is, and let's attack it from all different sides, right? We can disagree behind closed doors, but we know that the end game is liberation for our children. The end game is successful outcomes for the 8 million black children, right? So we know that and agree with that. We also have to have fact and reality, right? We also have to listen to what's on the ground. I did not go to an integrated school until I was a 16-year-old on the campus of Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and I didn't think I missed a damn thing.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, you probably because you got a culturally affirming education to let you know you didn't miss a damn thing, right? I mean, you have to kind of be like intellectually reprogrammed to believe that the only thing that helped you make it in your life. Listen, I'm not going to keep naming names, but we have a national celebrity in the pro-integration firm. Like the pro-integration movement has a national journalistic celebrity who literally says in speeches that she owes her entire kind of career success to the fact that her parents sent her across town to a school where there were only 4 black people, and she had a blue-eyed, blonde, white teacher who took her under her wing and loved her up so much, and she opened her to a world of possibilities and blah, 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 blah. That is literally the basis of her theology around integration, and educated Negroes are buying it lock, stock, and barrel, and it is so damaging to the black masses and the black people, because we're not talking about educational quality, practice, pedagogical instruction, all that stuff. The stuff that really matters in education all goes to the wayside if we can just racially balance schools.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, and we see, like, even 10 years after Brown versus Board, only 90% of the kids still went to segregated schools, right? Up south, the neighborhoods are segregated. If integration was the answer, then why aren't the school boards integrated? Why aren't the positions of power integrated? Let's start with that. Right? Let's start with that. Let's start with integrating the pots of money, where research shows that if it's a blacker school, a browner school, they get millions, if not billions less across the country. When you sum it all up, the difference between the funding is astronomical. So then some people say like, oh, we go to these overcrowded, underfunded, dilapidated buildings. That must be because there's no white kids.
Yeah, because melanin.
In some way, yes.
Yeah.
Right? In some way, yes.
Yeah.
But you can't conflate the two, that it's because of the soul and the intellect of the Black child and the love of education of the Black community.
Right.
That's where it all gets mixed up. Right? It's not just, oh, there's the resources are less. It's like, oh, those people are apathetic towards education. And you need
peer effects
to be next to us to show, so we can show you. But again, back to the civilizing, our children can show your child how to appreciate education.
No one talks about this, but part of the scientific racism that supports the integration case is peer effects, the research on peer effects. And the research on peer effects is being sold and told, as research says, you put too many Black people in together and concentrate them, that is the problem. The problem is their peers and their peer group actually hold everybody down. So you have to break up the peer group and put them into other peer groups to save them. And that's the research basis of integration.
Yeah, I mean, and my problem with that is it ignores the institutional racism that is the impact, right? Like that concentration of Black poverty, one, it was manufactured. You're going to ignore that. You're just going to blame the victim and say, oh, that was a problem, right? Like you're going to ignore all of the forces that crush communities of color, poor communities. And then you're going to blame the victim and say, oh, the reason why these outcomes are poor is because there's too many of y'all in this concentrated area. Not that, oh, housing, economics, the state, city, local funding is all routed away from you.
Imagine somebody coming to the Black community saying, I want to give y'all a speech on education because y'all schools is not getting the job done. Y'all not being educated. And I got the plan. Listen. So here's the whole thing in one sentence. I'm going to sum up all your problem. Your problem is your children have a terrible absence of white people in their lives. And if we really want to make your children do well, you got to add some white folks to your children's lives. Now, imagine giving that same speech in Idaho, to any white community. You know what y'all need? Y'all need some Negroes in your children's lives, right? Well, why would you not give it? Because that sounds absurd, right?
No, it doesn't. I actually think white people are smarter when they have Black and other people of color around them in proximity. I think they're smart. Like the ones who are humble and have a level of cultural humility, I think they're actually smarter. I think the justices should have said, like, you know what, the segregation of the races, they use the word, retard the development of Black children. I actually believe it's the opposite. I believe white children, because they are constantly ingesting, just like we are, anti-Blackness, they're ingesting anti-Blackness and their superiority at the same time. Right. So that's a double thing. Right. And so I think they have the arrested development when they are in segregated communities.
I do think that integration theology only makes that worse, though, because you're basically selling white people on the idea still today that the most benevolent that they could be is to share their superiority with this downtrodden group. Like your biggest contribution to racial justice could be just to accept the Negroes into your schools, and you'll be a good white person if you do that, because you're so good in general that if you do this, you'll make them better, and it won't even hurt you.
and you or your kids. And if you want to if you want to get an A+ on your benevolence, then sacrifice your child and send them to a mostly Black school. Because then that really shows. Because you just sacrifice. You can show other white people, like, listen, the savages didn't kill you. It was okay. The big Black buck was okay, actually.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so that argument
until you have some beige children. But
I see these quotes in the newspaper, like, somebody had to stand up and somebody had to, make the sacrifice. It ain't no sacrifice for you to send your kids sit next to mine. If anything, you are walking next to brilliance, right? Like what Zordell said, like, I don't get mad at races. I just wonder, like, why would you deprive yourself of my greatness?
I want to share this this quote. I'm going to put it on the screen here. there was a time many years ago in a winter before Martin Luther King left his congregation to go become a
Oh,
national
yes.
figure
Thank you. I was
for
going to ask
civil
you to
rights.
bring this
Yeah.
up. Thank you.
He was approached by two of his congregants, both teachers, a husband and wife team who taught in a local black high school. They were discussing civil rights with him and education, and getting his opinion on it. And this is what he said to them. He said, "I favor integration on buses and in all areas of public accommodation and travel. I am for equality. However, I think integration in our public schools is different. In that setting, you are dealing with one of our most important assets of an individual, the mind. White people view black people as inferior. A large percentage of them have a very low opinion of our race. People with such a low view of the black race cannot be given free rein and put in charge of the intellectual care and development of our boys and girls." This is Martin Luther King Jr., the icon of integration and lifelong advocate for integration, talking privately to two black educators about the fact that the strategy for integration makes sense in public accommodations and in everywhere in life, except for in the place where you're going to prepare the black mind. Mm-hmm. You do not turn over. And here we are all these years later, turning over the black mind every day, 8 million black minds, to another race for their intellectual development to be sent back to us ready to go, and it's not working out. I want to offer one more thing that is in line with this, and we talked about Derek Bell a little bit earlier. Derek Bell has a piece that people should look for. It's called "Serving Two Masters: Integration Ideals and Client Interests in School Desegregation Litigation." And in it, he's making the argument about educational quality should have always been the fight. No matter what you fight for, educational quality is the thing, not, some version of balancing students by race and color. He talks about the Coalition of Black Community Groups in Boston during the deseg area. They had a statement where they said, "In the name of equity, we seek dramatic improvement in the quality of education available to our children. Any steps to achieve desegregation must be reviewed in light of the Black community interest in improved pupil performance as a primary characteristic of educational equity." Right? So they're saying in this, we define educational equity as the absence of discriminatory pupil placement and improved performance for all children, period. It's quality. It's not racial balance. So by that measure, when we look at schools today, can we literally say that the ones that are doing racial balancing have as a primary concern the quality of education that Black children are getting?
No, this is it's absolutely, Julius. It is. I mean, huge problem. And when we look at, and going back to the Black Topekans, where most of them favored keeping their all Black schools because they were, and I quote, "Colored teachers know the psychology of the colored children better than a white teacher ever could." Right. And so when we're still talking about now, we're talking about like increasing, we're like 60 to 80,000 Black teachers fired in the aftermath of Brown versus Board. Now we have, we had Dr. Constance Lindsay on the 8 Black Hands a couple months ago, where she did research with some of her colleagues about the impact of Black teachers, right? And this is what I mean. Like, sometimes we already have the research, we have the evidence, we have our community, we have our ancestors, we have history, we have their anecdotes, we have their stories, we have their outcomes, right? They're saying long after, and then Dr. Lindsay and her colleagues once again proved. So I don't always say prove, I say once again proved that, hey, you know what? The dropout rate, the outcomes, all of this can be positively impact with more Black teachers in front of them, right? And back in 1950, they're saying like, hey, you know what? This Black teacher understands and respects and looks at that child. You could be my child. There are too many white teachers who look at that, and some Black teachers who look at that Black child and say, there's no way you can be my child. I'm just going to help train you and help civilize you. But you're not my equal. You're not my replacement. Like we talk to our educators about your job as leaders in our community is to train your replacements. That's why I go hard. That's why, for 26 years, I'm in the school and just like, I love y'all. You are my replacement. I have love for that. There are a lot of teachers and educators and school board members and superintendents. They're not looking at like, oh, I see those Black children as my replacement. They look at them as like, you can never be. If at most you will be my child's servant. You're not my replacement. I'm training you for a life of servitude to America.
And we know that, and we still turn the kids over to them. As we wrap, as we come to an hour, again, this always goes by so fast, and there's so much to say about these issues, and we can keep pulling on this thread. So this isn't going to be the last discussion. See lots of great comments that that we need to read and come back to, because folks are sharing experiences that they had that I think are important to get to. And
we should discuss. Do it, just like really diving into the topics that they brought up.
Feedback. Yeah. So what would be your bottom line right now if someone put you on the spot and said, okay, we've talked about integration for 65 years. We just talked about it for an hour. The Brown versus Board was a pivotal case. What's your main takeaway from that case? And how do you think it applies to educational strategy today for Black folks?
Yeah, I think what Derek Bell said was instructive, that quality education is the fight. It is the primary fight. When you look at the Brown family, and when they say, I had no quarrel about the Monroe Elementary School or the education I received there. In fact, we had a beautiful building. In fact, our teachers were superb. I loved it. I loved it. The teachers were fantastic, more like an extended family, like mothers, because they took a deep interest in you, right? And so when we look at the teachers who were in these all Black schools and the quality of education, and where they quote at another one of the Topeka schools, heart and hand have been taught, characters have been shaped, health has been guarded, and through work and play, the pupils have been helped towards organization and self-development. High standards applied to Black children who are expected to study and work hard. That's the quality of education. And the Black Topekans were worried that they had something to lose. And some of them said, you know what, we actually had everything to lose. And you know what? We're still losing.
All these years later.
All these years later. This is what, year 66, 67 years after Brown?
Yep. So 2014 would have been 60 years. So yeah. So it's like, 66 years and counting. My final takeaway is, listen, think about the fact that Thurgood Marshall said that within 5 years, this will all be a moot point, because 5 years after the passage of Brown, we're all going to be integrated. People will have forgotten they will be going to school together and will have forgotten their racial prejudice, because we'll all be together. He thought within 5 years that was going to happen in 1954. And what you see is in the 1960s is that everybody involved with the case was reconsidering their support of the way that the case worked out. It was the biggest miscalculation of light-skinned Black middle-class leadership in the history of light-skinned Black middle-class leadership. It was the biggest miscalculation. If we just pass this law, so we get these laws passed, we'll be seen as fully human, and racism will subside, and white families will start being accepting, and Black families will start getting a quality education. All love will break out. It'll be great.
Man,
that didn't happen within 5 years. It was a miscalculation. It was a deadly miscalculation for Black education, because there was no educational value in that. That was all sociological. It had nothing to do with how you teach, what you teach, where you teach, what kids learn, how you know what they learned, how you measure what they learned, outcomes, quality of instruction, how we induct teachers, how we prepare teachers. It had nothing to do with education. It had everything to do with the light-skinned desire to actually be seen as fully human through policy, through law. And it never worked out. That never worked out. That never became the case. Everyone from James Coleman, who did the Coleman report, to Kenneth Clark, who did the Dahl test, to Derek Bell, who was one of the attorneys and fought these cases in court. I could keep going down name by name. They all had recanted their support of that as the primary educational strategy by at least by 1970, but before in most cases. In the 1960s, almost all of Black thought trended a different direction, and the white media and masses never acknowledged that, till today, where we have people that are completely ignorant about the fact that the longest line of Black intellectual thought is not seeing Brown and integration as their primary educational strategy for closing all the gaps that we worry about. I feel like you were about to say something else. Did I cut you off there? Were you about to say
No. I'm just not. I'm just nodding in agreement and saying,
what I want to do for folks is I want to say to you, please check out a couple of things. Don't take my word for it or Sharif's word for it or whatnot, but let's just share documents with each other. Go back and read Zora Neale Hurston's letter. Go back and read W.E. Du Bois's piece called "Does the Negro Need Segregated Schools?" Go back and read Derek Bell's Covenant and Serving Two Masters. Please read this. I'm trying to get Dr. Tommy Curry on this broadcast. I think that this is just like an intellectually savage take on Black intellectual thought around integration and desegregation. It's so good. It's by Dr. Tommy Curry. It's called Saved by the Bell. It's a review of Derek Bell's racial realism in education, in pedagogy. I think it's a great read. So people, please go and check this out and read it. Come back at a future time, people who are watching and listening, whatnot. Let's build community around these discussions. Let's come back at this again and keep learning together, keep thinking about it together, and keep sharing resources. Sharif, is there any resource that you would point people to that you think they should read, or you know?
Yeah, there's an article that's really eye-opening. Blacks on Brown, intra-community debates over school desegregation in Topeka, Kansas. Charise Cheney. Charise Cheney. It was the source is the Western Historical Quarterly.
What's the Lord, brother, if this is behind a firewall, we're gonna have problems.
You know what? But you know what? I
Here
will.
It is.
You
In JSTOR. Yeah, Blacks on Brown, intra-community debates over school desegregation, Topeka, Kansas, written by Charise Cheney. It's in the Western Historical Quarterly, pages 481 to 500. So there's your, whatever.
I'm putting it in our private chat. If you can send it over to the audience.
Okay. I mean, listen, this is what gets me about America and capitalism and education and information. Yeah. Like, look at this right here, $39 to understand your people and your history, for one download.
Well, yeah, no worries. I got a PDF. I just sent you a PDF.
Did you send me the PDF? All right. For people listening and watching, you got the bootleg about to come up.
And I think also just the Silent Covenants by Derek Bell, Brown versus Board of Education and the Unfulfilled Hopes for Racial Reform, I think is also a great book that I picked back up for this conversation. What you and we both blogged about this multiple times over the years. Which you can find on Citizen Ed, you can find on Philly 7th Ward, and this is a conversation that we have to continue to have. And
let's keep doing it. Let's stay committed to it. For the people watching and listening, I appreciate you every day coming here, being with us, adding so much to the debate and the discussion. What I want from you right now, this is my request. A couple of things. Number one, if you enjoy these conversations, please share it with other people so that we build community around these ideas and these thoughts. Two, let's help each other be better. So what I really want from you is send me links, documents, pieces of information, whatever you think makes this discussion richer and better, something you thought you should have heard in this discussion and didn't, please send it to me. My email address, as always, Christopher@activist.com. Christopher@activist.com. I also would like to hear from you if you have any ideas for shows and guests, people who can add to this discussion. I'm sure people listening and watching today are thinking, you should have had so-and-so on. Please let us know who that is. As always, appreciate you. Love y'all. This is like one of the highlights of my week to have these discussions. It's one of my favorite things. Sharif, as always, brother, you are just amazing. You bring so much to these discussions. You're a fountain of information and knowledge, and I love it.
No, I was going to say the same to you, man. I appreciate just all the, the research and history. And, I just wish that, more school board members had this information, this context. more families, more parents, right, and more activists. We have a lot of activists who are activating around on the wrong road. So I appreciate what you're doing, and just this platform to have Freedom Fridays. It's a great way to end end my week, as I said earlier.
People love the Freedom Fridays thing. I just want to tell you that, right? Like, I think, people are hungry for there to be freedom every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, our students, and our staff, we have woke Wednesdays, and we would just wear these political shirts and stuff. We're like,
wow.
Well, every day needs to be a woke day. Like, we always should just be sharing these messages and whatnot. So
we should come up with one every day.
Yeah.
Like there should be a woke Wednesday. I don't know what Tuesday would be, but I'm also going to put in the link for listeners and watchers, the link to our YouTube channel that has all of these past discussions in case you missed some of the discussions. They're all in one place. We got a YouTube channel. Please subscribe and share it with other people. Thank you all. We appreciate you. Appreciate you, Sharif.
Yeah, thank you, man. Thank you.